wandering in. Thank you very much for joining us in another session with Brad Olsen, and he probably doesn't need too much of an invitation. A description of who and what he does. I think you see him on TV more than you see the weather forecasters, but that's fine. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Toilets are out here and around the other side of the atrium. I think those that have been to the atrium will know where it is. In case of an earthquake, this building is well and truly earthquake strengthened, but we're out through the doors. And if you look to Kate here, follow her, she'll show you where to go. It's a fairly chaotic world that we're in at the moment. And so one of the reasons we've asked Brad to come up and have a chat about not only the budget, but other bits and pieces, is to give you guys a bit of a steer on what you should do with your businesses. At the moment, business is facing headwinds. The Reserve Bank is tightening, probably faster than ever. Interest rates have risen and could continue. Wage rates are climbing. The labour market is over tight. The number of bureaucrats is increasing, and the amount of compliance is increasing. How's that?
Just tighten a little bit on.
And inflation is with us, and I think those are going to be some subjects that Brad will touch on. So we look forward to hearing from Brad, and maybe he can tell us when we're going to be a rock star economy once again.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is fantastic. It's a real privilege actually to be getting out across the country after 2 years of not having to wear pants and being able to sit there in sort of gym shorts and similar. So I've bought some more for these various trips that I'm starting to go on. But it's also, I think, important to highlight how good it is to also hear from what's happening out there locally on 10 minutes ago, I got off a call with the Reserve Bank of New Zealand about what's happening with interest rates and their expectations. And to go from that sort of interaction to an audience like this is actually really powerful. And I'm very much expecting that some of your questions towards the end give me as much information today as I hope to impart to you. For the next half an hour or so, I want to profile a few things. Yes, there'll be a fair bit on the budget, but I also want to highlight what we're seeing out there across the economy, particularly here in the Waikato. Also, though, thinking about some of the opportunities and challenges that are coming, because for the first time in the last 2 and a bit years, there isn't the level of government support that there has been, and it means that we are starting to stand on our own 2 feet at a time when the outlook for the economy, both here in New Zealand, more importantly across the world, is probably more uncertain than ever. To start with, the key challenge we really start to see across New Zealand is just how difficult it is to have people coming to work. We know that during the peak of Omicron, over 300,000 New Zealanders were having to stay at home either with COVID-19 or having to isolate as household contacts. What's really challenging is that by our estimates at the moment, there's still over 100,000 people a day that have to do that. And if you're a business and you're still not sure of whether or not your staff are able to come in, that is a huge limitation, especially at a time when finding temporary replacements for that workforce is not impossible. What we do know, though, and what's been quite surprising, if you will, is looking forward across the economy, that there's been a lot of people more than willing to put their hand up to support activity going further. So although you had all of these people that were unable to go to work, in the first 3 months of the year, the amount of hours worked across the New Zealand economy was down 0.2%, barely anything. And that's because for all of the people that couldn't work, there were a lot more that dug hard and kept going. We also know, though, that leave balances across the economy are probably up on average around about 24%. People are stressed, and we really do risk burning out, both as an economy, but probably more importantly, burning out our staff who have been trying to work through and push forward as much as possible. So a real difficulty there for New Zealand to be able to grow further if we have very much burnt the candle at both ends and have made it reduced to a stub. So I'm going to give this one a crack one more time and try and lift it up. There we go. We might stick with that one for a second. We also know, though, that amongst all of this, we also see a really challenging outlook, that households are now telling us that they are the most pessimistic on record going back to 2004. Remembering that is more pessimistic than you saw during the depths of the global financial crisis, worse than the start of COVID-19 when we thought we were looking down the Great Depression 2.0. And that is a real concern for us, because if people don't feel very good, then their actions often speak louder than their words and things go into a darker place. For the minute, though, there is a bit of a difference between the 2 figures. because, as you can see, spending is actually all right, all things considered. Now, it's not rosy, it's not amazing, it's not gangbusters, and inflation is taking up a fair bit of that as well. But the fact that people are getting out there and that people are willing to pull the cash, or more likely at the moment their credit cards, out of their back pockets, is helping things move forward. And so there's a bit of a difference there, right, in terms of people thinking that there is some bad stuff to come, but at the moment being more than willing to keep things going. Now, you notice on this slide the amount of spending you're seeing in the regional economy still holding up fairly well relative to the national average. A real mark of support there for the regional economy, people very much showing that confidence and voting with their dollars. Important as well to see some of the regional or more local differences there. The likes of Waipa, and this is true for a number of the more provincial parts of the region, trending in a much stronger position. We know that some of our more urban centres not going quite as well, although again, still the likes of Hamilton proceeding better than Auckland and the Wellington City. So a vote of confidence there, but real headwinds about how much spending will continue to endure. Just quickly, our latest monitor, I just want to highlight some of the success stories, if you will, coming through here in terms of there still being a fair bit of momentum. It is a bit weaker. Omicron and COVID Delta last year has certainly weakened the economic impulse, but still a number of key metrics coming through. So still some support, a fair bit of support coming through for the economy. However, and this will come as no surprise to most of you, it's just so difficult to find staff at the moment. More importantly, perhaps, is that we've always struggled in some way, shape or form to find staff, not quite as bad as before, as we find it now. What's more critical is that we're also losing the staff that people currently have, and that is a bit more of a difference than what we've seen in prior times. Businesses across New Zealand are currently reporting that they are seeing job poaching at the highest level since the 1970s. And so for as much as people are looking out there to try and find new workers, they're also having to work very hard to keep the current workers in their seats to make sure they don't run away. And the difficulty there at a time when we know that there are very few people apparently spare in the economy means that those two issues together, not being able to find new staff and also struggling to keep current staff, is a huge concern. What does it look like across the region? Well, basically everyone is growing. There's a few little bits and pieces here and there that aren't going quite so well, but the sheer amount of additional jobs since pre-pandemic times is huge, and probably one of the strongest charts that I've been able to pull together. Like I say, I do a fair number of these presentations across the country, and I don't think I've pulled together the chart like this that has just so many jobs coming forward. So again, a real credit of strength, and also highlighting the areas that we see the economy most focused on. Of course, construction big, given the amount of development going on across the Waikato region, but also health, reassuringly in a pandemic, making sure that we do have the workforce there. But again, the risks remain over those workforces. As we know, global conditions are also making people look elsewhere. And the biggest one probably for businesses is that all of this is coming at an extreme cost. Now, there's a lot of different measures that economists will use to think about wages and similar. This one's a fairly simple one. Take the entire wage bill for the economy, divide it by the total number of people that are earning that money. And what you see there is not only that growth is at the highest level on record, but it has accelerated to that point in the fastest time on record going back the last 20 years. The pressure on people's balance sheets and being able to continue to pay these very high wages at a time when it's just so difficult to find additional resources is huge. This is why I do the talking and not the electronics and similar. With all of that, we know that the economy is incredibly constrained. We know that difficulties on actually growing further are huge. And in our minds, although we do expect the New Zealand economy to continue to grow, the risk is that it is more expensive and a lot harder to find that growth over the next few years because the economy is running hot, and we're starting to do what happened to my first car. We're running the engine without any oil in it. You can only do that for so long before it burns out. What does Treasury expect though? Well, Treasury's expectations are fairly upbeat really on how things are going, but with a number of red flags coming forward. Treasury expects from their budget announcements that GDP growth will stay at a much stronger level. Now, on these numbers here, you don't have a recession. That dreaded R word has been coming forward a little bit more in recent times. We're probably a little bit more worried about the risk of recession, but if it was a recession, it would be a very different recession than what we saw and what most people think of mass unemployment, going back to the global financial crisis, things falling down around our ears. If we did see that dreaded R word come back in the next 12 months or so, what it would more look like is that the New Zealand economy would be trying to grow, but just desperately unable to find the people and the materials to resource that growth. The US economy was technically in contraction at the start of this year, not because they didn't do a lot of work. In fact, they did the most work on record. It's just the domestic economy couldn't cope. And so, like us, we're starting to have to import a lot more very expensive goods and services to try and keep up and match that gap in what we can do here locally and how much work the economy wants to do. Which leads me on to probably the most important slide in the slide pack, and I will dwell on this for a while, and that is inflation. Treasury now expects not only that inflation goes higher, but it sticks at that higher level for longer. Let me tell you, you give inflation an inch and it will take a mile. It has been taking a mile, and that is a real concern for everyone across the economy, because with those prices remaining higher, not only are we having to grapple with the Reserve Bank having to turn the tap on very quickly when it comes to interest rate increases, but also people are finding it very difficult to plan for the future when prices are so uncertain. And we know that people are, in a sense, getting giddy over and trying to clamber over themselves with how many increases in prices they can put forward. That worries us as economists. If I go around to most businesses at the moment, I say, hey, what are you thinking about when it comes to prices? Everyone just about jumps up and with glee and says, oh, we're raising them. And we're raising them more than we need to because we want to stay ahead of the curve. And we're raising them more frequently than we've done before because we don't want to get caught short. And we're very much happy to keep raising, even though we know that our competition is looking at us because their cost pressures are increasing too. And either we can move our prices up or we can see our margins fall and be quite limited. So look, the amount of what economists call the lack of price discipline is huge, because without that ability for people to stick around their prices, things will continue to get worse. What's concerning to us, in a sense, is that these Treasury forecasts, the blue line, light blue line there, worse than what we think. And let me tell you, as an economist, we are the doomsayers. We talk some pretty gnarly stuff, and I expect people to leave this room and sort of go, that was probably the most depressing thing I've heard in a while. Realistically, if the Treasury is even worse than us, you know that things are in a bad place. And that does worry us, because by Treasury's estimates, inflation doesn't get back under control until 2025. That says that even the Treasury doesn't think the Reserve Bank can get their job done in the next few years, and that is a huge worry. What we're also seeing, though, of course, is a real difficulty around what those increasing prices do to households. And the difficulties, of course, is also that we don't expect that there is a huge amount of relief around the corner. If we look at some of the drivers of inflation, we can see that it is thankfully not getting particularly worse when it comes to shipping costs, but it's also not getting all that much better. 2.5 years now into the pandemic, and it's still costing you 6 times what it did to bring a container into the country. Now, like I said, not all that much worse, but certainly hasn't been improving at the rate that we might have been expecting. And I think that I've been saying for about 12 months now that it's 12 months away before things might be better. So maybe I'll just be a bit more generous for myself and say 2 years. The difficulty, as we see it at the moment, is there's not a huge ability for us to correct our supply chain issues any better. We know there's global issues in the likes of Ukraine and coming out of Eastern Europe. But this chart here is probably one of the scariest you might see for a while. This is the number of ships that are waiting to be either loaded or unloaded to Chinese ports. And at the moment, given how important we know that Southeast Asia is to New Zealand's trade profile and to the global shipping sector in general, this sort of disruption, the huge amount of backlog coming through from lockdowns across China, is a real limitation, and means that although we're not seeing prices get particularly worse, we're also very much feeling that things don't have a huge ability to improve. With all of that, what's interesting, there's been a huge amount of debate, and I don't want to get into it too much because I feel like we could find a bit of a political bun fight emerging, but there's been a huge amount of discussion over who's responsible for this inflation. All I will say is that Treasury has made a very clear statement that in their view, you've got a very hot domestic economy running up against supply chain issues exacerbated by global factors. Now, note there that their statement is that domestic comes first and global exacerbates the issues. On this chart here, a little bit technical, bear with. Non-tradables inflation, I only say that because honestly, some people look at these and go, what on earth are you about to tell me? But I will break it down. The non-tradables is the domestically based stuff. Tradables is what we import. Now, we can't influence a lot of what we import as much as I want to. I can't tell Russia how much they should charge for fuel oil. But we do know that the non-tradable stuff is much more in New Zealand's wheelhouse in terms of what we can influence. What worries us is that Treasury's estimates are that non-tradables inflation, that domestically based heat in the economy continues to drive the higher inflation we're likely to see over the next few years. And so in very simple terms, we have the New Zealand economy running too hot. It wants to do this much stuff. It has this much resource, this many materials, this many people, and the gap between it is inflation. Because if I know that I want to build a house and I know that Don wants to build one too, I will pay more than him to make sure my house gets built first. Same house, same materials, but I will pay more, and that is what that inflation is happening across the economy. The pressures that we're seeing are quite intense. Now, just to give you a bit of a flavour of how unusual this inflation is, and depending on who's in the room, in fact, most of you probably do have a bit of an idea. I wasn't born the last time inflation was this high. More importantly, my parents had only just started dating at the time. And so the challenges that New Zealand faces is that this is the first time since the early 1990s that we've had this level of inflation and that we've had an agency that's charged to deal with it. And we are really struggling to bring it under control. All of that does mean, though, that that agency that is charged with dealing with it is going to have to get on with the job a lot quicker. You saw that announcement yesterday with the Reserve Bank making a further 50 basis point increase to the official cash rate. Interest rates are lifting, and they are lifting fast. You'll see the evolution here of what the Reserve Bank thinks they need to do. And what you are seeing is the more worried they get about how persistent inflation is here, the more they think they have to front load, which is absolutely the right move. Waiting too long means that people start to have an expectation that inflation will remain high for longer. And I guess just look, quick show of hands, who thinks that inflation, I'm not going to ask if you think inflation is under control, it's obviously not, but who thinks it will be under control within the next year? That is scary. Normally we don't have to ask that question because things always trend back to normal. There's a feeling that things are working against inflation. We spent 2 weeks at university learning about it during undergraduate and being told quite clearly you don't need to remember much of this. The inflation dragon has been killed. It is back and it does require some very uncomfortable medicine, but to get it under control will take a bit of time. All of that comes as even Treasury expects that the interest rates will have to increase, although again, on top of a very large debt pile that the government has, it's still manageable to service, but will cost us a lot more too. What I guess is quite worrying is that the pace of change we're going to have to see to get inflation under control, to really squeeze the life out of it, means that we are, on Treasury's estimates at least, having quite a big shift in the unemployment rate likely to come forward. Now, I show you this chart because this worries me. This says that within a few years, we could well have the lowest unemployment on record go back up to 4.8%. And it does just suggest that if there's any risk around the labour market, if this is the central projection, I think we could well actually be in for a much tighter period of unemployment, because at the moment we just really struggle to see where all of these people are magically going to come from. When we look at migration, we do have, for the first time since the combination of the Christchurch earthquakes, of the global financial crisis and of the Australian mining boom, an outflow of talent, particularly in our 20 to 29-year-old group. They are flying overseas. Now, very unscientific poll, but it is my age group that's running away. 55% of those that I surveyed in my age group, up to about 35, had said that they were either seriously looking or had already made a commitment to move overseas. The shift is huge. And what it means as well, particularly for our more provincial areas like here in the region, is that although we know that inward migration from overseas often concentrates in our major cities, Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch, the loss of young talent will be very much felt across provincial areas as well, because people are going to be looking at, what do I do for my next job? Maybe it's not in New Zealand at all. Maybe I don't move to Hamilton from a smaller centre. Maybe I don't look at all around the rest of the country. I'm heading as quickly as possible onto a plane. Now, part of that is a classic OE. We know that people have only got up until 30 before they can't go to the UK. What we also know, though, is that if you go over to Australia, you earn $200 more per week on average than you do here. Money talks very clearly, and so people are very much reacting to that amount of cash that's being put on offer. We're really worried because at the same time as we know that borders are reopening, we know that there are 40,000 New Zealanders who haven't left over the last 2 years. Why would you? Fortress New Zealand was one of the safest places to be. But now that we're unlocking, there is a huge amount of backlog of pent-up demand of people looking to move overseas. At the same time, New Zealand has existed over the decade after the global financial crisis by growing the population to grow the economy. 50 to 60,000 people net a year moved into the country. I don't think they will to the same degree anymore. We know that New Zealand was one of the last countries in the developed world to open up, which means that if you were looking for a place to move to, if you're a skilled migrant looking for an opportunity, everyone else has made you a better offer earlier. Canada, the US, the UK, Australia, and similar. We also know that if you're wanting to come into New Zealand, it's going to take you at least 5 months just to get the right paperwork being done, and the slow, just real challenge around trying to process so many bits of paper for Immigration New Zealand and the government is a real restriction. And probably most importantly, we know that house prices are really high, and at the moment this is a challenge for both bringing people into the country and for our young people, because the offer on the table at the moment is house prices that cost you on average 10 times your annual household income. It's not a particularly attractive option when we're trying to attract people in, or when we're saying to people, hey, would you like to stick around? We are expecting, well, Treasury is expecting better things to come, and again, I guess a risk in a sense of the Treasury's forecast here. Treasury says that, yep, inflation is high, but going forward, the pressure on the labour market is going to be coming forward, and we are expecting that wages will have to rise to meet that level of demand. What I do want to highlight for you is a bit of an inconsistency as I see it. Now, I showed you before that Treasury is expecting the unemployment rate to increase to 4.8%. You've also just seen in the previous slide that they expect that net migration comes back to a positive level over the 2024-25 period. But through all of that, apparently we're going to have wages that remain strong. Now, I completely agree that they're strong at the moment. Unemployment is at 3.2%. We know that it's difficult to find people because they're leaving. But if you all of a sudden have a 4.8% unemployment rate, more people coming in, there's not nearly going to be as much pressure as there is now on wages. So a real difficulty of how we not only grow the economy, but make ourselves all richer in the process. Do we actually see the sort of productivity gains that we need to make, like Don said, a rock star economy? Or do we run the risk very much of continuing in the much more low wage economy that we have been accustomed to over recent years? All of this comes as the government does have a fair bit of additional money coming in, but also a fair bit of additional spending that it wants to get going. Over the forecast period, you can see quite a considerable amount of that additional cash coming forward. The really challenging thing here is that the government wants to get on with some very big work streams. We've heard some huge announcements from government that they are transformational and they want to make some stuff happen. The difficulty is the amount of work happening at the moment requires some serious dollars to be put into it. And in our minds, the difficulty here is very much on the delivery. They might well have the cash, but just how can we do it when we know that the public sector is already stretched? We know that the public sector is taking more workers off the private sector at a time when there's not a lot of resource in the economy. It is going to be difficult to grow. It's going to be difficult to deliver on some of these promises. And what you do see at the moment is still a government that is spending more money than it's bringing in. Now, we know in a sense that it would be quite incredible for the government to be still spending the same amount that it did last year. We don't have a wage subsidy at the moment. We haven't spent that additional $20 billion this year. But what we are seeing is once you strip out all of the emergency COVID spending that's come through the wage subsidy and similar, the government underlying that is still spending more money out into the economy than it's bringing in. And that's part of the reason why the government now takes longer to get back into surplus. So the sort of fiscal measures, the short answer to this chart here is that although the government isn't pouring a huge amount of additional stimulus into the economy, the fact is that the government spending levels at the moment are still more stimulatory. They still add more into the economy than what you had pre-pandemic. And at a time when we know that there's not a lot of resource there, that is starting to generate even more inflation. And like I said, all of that meaning that we return to surplus a year later. Now, the whole too long don't read with the budget, I think, in terms of the fiscal outlook, is that there is expectations that things will improve, but it does take a bit longer and it is costlier to deliver on that growth over time because of inflation, because of the resource limitations that we see across the New Zealand economy. Without people, without stuff to make, we do struggle. Going forward, though, we do also expect that debt returns to a better position. Now, the government did, before the budget, change how we report on debt. Regardless really of what number you want to look at, the fact is that we are still able to repay what we are owing at the moment, but It also means that because of how high we've had to lift debt in recent times, there's a limitation still on doing much more. We know that it's going to be a real challenge to deliver additional infrastructure projects over the next few years because, again, we know that we don't have a huge amount of additional construction workforce, and we know, again, that finding the materials to build roads and bridges and similar is being caught up in other parts of the world. Steel prices are high, aggregates are high, it's just difficult to do work. With all of this, we know that regardless of what the macroeconomic numbers look like, if you will, the real challenge with inflation is that it hurts, and it hurts people really hard in the back pocket, especially those who don't have an ability to change their spending as much. From the government this time around, we saw this announcement of a cost of living payment, $27 a week roughly for 2.1 million New Zealanders from August to October to try and offset some of that cost. Now, the very simple, I think, explanation for this is that the government couldn't do nothing when it came to cost of living. They'd be seen as far too mean. They risked, though, spending too much money and adding even more inflation into the environment. So a careful balance suggests that $27 a week might be an all right position to move to. It did, however, come at quite a sizable cost, not only the $800 million coming through, but also at a time when we know that by our own estimates, the average New Zealand household is spending an extra $70 to $100 a week in just their core essential costs. And as much as $27 a week is helpful, it isn't that full $70 to $100. So the difficulty still for households is intense. More importantly, although you've got the likes of the government support through to October, there's no indication of what comes next. The current government view is that there shouldn't be any need to have some further support through after October. Inflation hopefully will have peaked by then and be coming down. It seems like a politically naive opportunity for the government. I'd find it very hard to believe that come October, they're very happy and with less than a year before the next election, to massively increase fuel excise tax back by 25 cents a litre. That's going to be fairly unpopular, and to just let people go cold turkey at a time when those costs are so high is going to be a huge, huge challenge. Again, by our thinking, when we look at the numbers, the inflation over the next few years adds about $89 a week in 2022 to average costs, and $64 a week on top of that again in 2023. $27 a week for 3 months is certainly not going to cut it there. Inflation also, as it is, I'm sure, with all of your businesses, hitting the government as well. And this is probably the real kicker, is that although I've talked about how expensive and hard it is for the economy generally to grow, it also means that the finance minister has some very tricky accounting to work on with next year. Treasury estimates that the government needs $3.5 billion next year just to keep the lights on, to deliver the exact same amount of services that they are this year because of how high inflation is. Government's, however, only got about $2.5 billion worth of spare money next year currently allocated to be able to spend on that. It doesn't take too much of a mathematics genius to figure out that there's $1 billion hole in that just from inflation. The difficulty, I think, for government is that it's got to plug that hole somewhere. Either it's got to do what politicians characterise as reprioritisation, which is basically cutting something doesn't get left in the budget next year. It either has to do that, has to raise revenue, which is increase taxes to try and make up more cash, or it's got to increase the allowance and borrow that money to allow for that further investment. Again, all very challenging opportunities and really difficult options there for the government to consider. We did see some really long-term thinking, though, coming through from the government and a real need to do that. $3.1 billion being announced for the health sector in general to try and clear some of the DHB deficits, remembering that because the population has grown so much faster in recent times than what the government was expecting, we haven't been resourcing our hospitals and our medical professionals quite as well. Additional money also being poured in for the likes of additional paramedics, more ambulances, more rescue helicopter trips, and what have you. All very important to create a much better world-class health system into the future. The missing piece for me is that through all of this, we know that we could have the most gleaming, fantastic world-class system possible, but if we don't have the staff to put into it, we will continue to fail. There was no announcement for allied health professionals or for nurses around pay parity agreements and similar. And again, without having people there, we really not only risk the burnout that we're currently seeing in the health sector, but importantly, people who are looking at opportunities overseas where they can start to get more money. There is a real difficulty here in the budget of not being able to pay enough more to secure the workforce that we know we need for a long-term New Zealand better outlook. And just some other key announcements. We saw additional investments made across the education sector. Again, playing a lot of catch up. I think $200 million being announced just for the likes of furniture and similar for schools after quite a long period where we obviously haven't been investing enough. Various new sites for schools and new, I think, 40 different places across the country getting new classrooms. We've got to get that spending right, but again, we need the people to be able to resource that growth. A new feasibility study into the likes of Manukau Port idea. Now that one's been banding around the traps for a while. My one comment on ports is that we need to have a national strategy for that. We, for too long, have been operating with sort of every various port thinking that they can do their own thing. Increasingly, there is a need, as we see supply chains break down, to need to do something better there. And just finally, a $100 million investment fund from being co-funded with government and the private sector to try and allow small businesses a bit more access to capital. One thing that has been in there and that's worth profiling is quite a sizable increase to what the government is willing to grant you if you're wanting to buy your first home. Now, important in terms of the additional money that people can get for buying a home, but also a real damning indictment there in terms of just how challenging the housing environment remains. So I thought I'd put the local numbers up there in case anyone in the room is thinking desperately about what sort of support they might be able to get from government. The next slide, though, is probably more challenging. And that's that although house prices are expected to decline, they're not going to go down by too much. You can see some very, very small falls here, really from the likes of the Reserve Bank and the Treasury. The three numbers that I'd urge you to keep in your mind is that by the middle of 2023, when Treasury expects house prices to be at their lowest, house prices will still be 32% higher than pre-pandemic levels. At the same time, wages will have increased by 18% and inflation by 17%, which means that for every dollar additional that someone's earned, they've taken another step backwards in terms of the cost that they're having. Their house price that they might want to buy has increased at double the pace of the earning potential, and with interest rates now going higher, you're having or being able to borrow considerably less than what you could a year or two back. And so the difficulties there, the lack of affordability still across New Zealand says that one of our longest term challenges remains the housing market and the difficulty that provides, especially if we're trying to attract people. If they haven't got anywhere to live, they're not going to be coming to work. Just lastly, two final broad comments around some of the challenges that are coming up for New Zealand. We've looked a lot into ourselves at the moment. There is a very insular view. As we start to emerge from COVID-19, we are starting to broaden our horizons. And let me tell you, if you are looking out there across the world, you're not being met with anything particularly great. Yes, there might be some holidays to Australia and similar on the cards, but the rest of the global news is fairly grim. We've got another war coming through, probably the worst security issues since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and before that, the likes of the Second World War. But we also know that the entire sort of global order seems to be in a state of flux. People are not nearly as willing to interact globally. We're still seeing those supply chain disruptions coming forward with no end in sight. We see the likes of both Pakistan and Sri Lanka, important parts of the Southeast Asian broader economy, doing incredibly poorly. One government's been ousted. In fact, almost both of them have been now. People worried about the amount of earnings coming forward. And of course, as a trader, New Zealand has to take note of those challenges. We also see probably the most concerning one, of course, moving through with the likes of the Solomon Islands and a real shift in geopolitics. China remains New Zealand's most important trading partner, taking a third of all of our goods trade each year. Increasingly, there is a lot of interactions between New Zealand and the world security policy and what our economics are telling us. But what we also know going forward is that although we might not want to ever pick a side, it's increasingly obvious that we might well be stuck in a very uncomfortable position between two large superpowers who are vying for control. That is going to be difficult for us. Going forward, though, I do want to end with a little bit of optimism. And that is that we are seeing better things to come. As grim as the outlook is, there are some blue skies on the horizon, but only if we work for them. We know that the revival of the US economy, although it has, again, some challenging inflationary numbers, there are also a lot of people, 300 million in fact, who are very willing to do business. They have been supported through the pandemic by their government. They are more flush with cash. They're very happy to be buying our goods and services. We're looking, of course, to try and force our way back into that market. I think one of the best announcements I've seen in recent times was Air New Zealand deciding to fly direct to New York as soon as possible, because getting back there in person remains critical. We also know that India is a huge opportunity for us. New Zealand has been lagging in that environment. Australia picked us to the post. They've got an agreement with India, the largest growing economy in the world, will overtake China in terms of population soon. We don't currently have that beachhead there. It means that our traders are missing out. So some opportunities there, but a difficult path to achieve them. Speaking yesterday to the Swedish ambassador to New Zealand, who was mentioning some of the fantastic Hamilton businesses that he was visiting, I think last week, discussing the likes of a free trade agreement with the EU. Very much a big fish and something we haven't landed yet, but market access to, again, one of the most important global institutions that we see around the world, a very expensive and timely endeavour, but something that we will see some real advantages of if we can push that over the line. And just finally, the idea that finally, and the shift really that's coming forward in the export space is that New Zealand has always been good at goods. We ship physical stuff overseas. We're known to be a provider, and certainly here in the Waikato as well, being known as a breadbasket really for the world. Increasingly, though, we're looking at those other opportunities as supply chains come up, as we consider where we go to next, and we're seeing some very smart, some very bright innovation coming forward. People making far more services to be able to send overseas and just getting on with it. So some real opportunity there when it comes to the global environment. With that, the final sort of conclusion I guess I'll leave you with is that, like I said, it is going to be harder. It is going to be more expensive to grow. Those price challenges that we see across the New Zealand economy are not going anywhere soon, and the very bitter medicine that we will have to swallow to correct that challenge is to swallow some very high interest rates to try and bring demand back in line with what is a very supply-constrained economy. The budget sets some important long-term directions, but in the short term, there are some incredibly difficult financial challenges to overcome at a time when we know that there aren't a lot of people and there's certainly not a lot of materials moving about the world. The rest of the world is seemingly on fire. The challenges globally are immense and the worst since in many decades. But the opportunities for New Zealand to remain in a much stronger position, to be seen as a global leader, to be forging a better path forward, are very much there if we are willing to take them. With that, with probably a fair bit of doom and gloom that has set the room very quiet, I expect, very happy to try and take some of your questions. Favourite schedule. Don.
How they should react to the advice beyond the
Totally. I guess 2 points on price increases for business. One, recognising that now is still probably the best time ever to increase prices because people know that things are going up. But realistically, it's because people's price, your own cost increases are coming forward. This is not just making money for money's sake. There are some real challenges coming through. So I think being realistic about that and being very open in the communication when it comes to the increase that suppliers are putting on you as a business and communicating that with customers in terms of the difficulties that you're under. I think also though being aware and recognising that things are shifting rapidly. The Reserve Bank is putting people on notice that stuff is about to cost a lot more when it comes to your loans, your interest rates and your investments. If that's the case, then it's time to think now about what the budget might look like when those interest rates go up. Because although we know that interest rates won't immediately flip over the day after an OCR announcement, the signal there is very clear. The longer a business leaves it before they reevaluate that lending position, the harder a transition path is going to be and the more uncomfortable it will be for businesses to get into a more even keel. Basically, the story is here that it's going to be much more expensive to borrow. So if you're currently sitting on something that you can spend a lot on, be ready to cut back that spending because at the moment the economy is doing too much work than what it can resource, and the Reserve Bank is very deliberately trying to limit just how much demand is there. Now that I've really thoroughly addressed it, sir.
Just got a couple of questions. Whereabouts were you born?
Whangarei. You're probably not wrong there, to be fair.
Yeah. What's your take on the supermarket modelling?
Nothing seems to be out of scope in these presentations, to be fair. Look, I think it's the sort of thing, it's pretty clear, right? If you don't have a lot of competition and there's only two operators, it's a bit easier for numbers to maybe not go super high, but certainly not to stay as low as you might have otherwise seen them. I think though, looking at how you correct that has got to be quite critical. We were quite bemused at the thoughts from government that they'd just sort of make a Kiwi mart, if you will, and do it themselves. The issue quite clearly at the moment is that, look, very simply, if I want to go and get groceries at the end of the day, I want to go to one place, not 5 different shops, and I want it to be convenient. Therefore, it needs to be in a location that I'm going to drive to or from on my way home from work. The issue, therefore, and what the Commerce Commission has rightly identified is that when you make it really difficult to find a bit of land on any sort of accessible spot where you'd actually naturally want to put a supermarket, it's pretty difficult for anyone to look at it and go, there's any money to be made here, because the costs of entry are so difficult. And also, if you can't get the wholesaling, if you can't get your supermarket fully kitted out with the entire range, then again, people are going to not want to go there because they can't get their full supermarket order all at once. Those are the two issues that need to be addressed, and they are. In fairness, you saw on budget day, the government moved quite quickly to remove some of those barriers around people being able to purchase land that is in a good, viable spot. And over time, you're going to see more movements, I think, on that wholesale market. So there's not quite as tight control over all of the various inputs. So if you want your chicken breast or whatever it might be, and you want to start up a new supermarket, you actually have an ability to buy that. That's going to be critical. Let's be clear, that's not going to deliver cheaper prices particularly quickly, but in a sense, nothing ever will. And I think we've got to be quite careful probably to divorce the longer term issues of the supermarkets and their current profit levels and the inability to start up a third supermarket with very high inflation. Very high inflation is a temporary, hopefully, thing, saw it up there, temporary enough for 5 years, but very much something that isn't going to be solved by getting your competition better. And I only say that because a lot of people say, well, if we sort out the competition, then of course we'll get prices to go down. All I'll say is that for as expensive as prices are at the moment, it seems weird that if everyone was able to absolutely cream it because they have no competition, they'll be doing a very bad job of creaming it over the last few years when there wasn't very high inflation. So important to divorce the two issues. In all honesty, I think people are going to have to look at the bottom line quite carefully because, I mean, prices are just going up. The point I'll probably make on the likes of Sky and Netflix is that a lot of people have got a lot of subscriptions that you just pay every month because they're relatively cheap on a 1 month basis. You know, Netflix is less than $20 a month. I'm trying to think how much. I think I might pay like $18.99 or something for it. And it's the sort of thing, because it's not a huge part of the, my statement or when I look at my bank account, I just let it tick over. And eventually when those prices rise, people do reconsider it. I expect that if everyone here sat down for 5 minutes and tallied up all of the subscriptions that you have each month or each week, you'd come up with a huge amount of cash. Now, sometimes that might well be worth it, but what we're also seeing is that people are having to cut back on something. And importantly, people are starting to rationalize. So maybe it's that you have a Disney Plus account and a Neon account and a Netflix account and an Amazon Prime account and similar. Yep, there might be a few TV shows you watch on each. You know that you're pretty busy at the moment, though. Maybe you want to go outdoors a bit more. Maybe it's easy enough to cut back 1 or 2. You don't need to completely cut the legs out from under the entertainment budget, but it does have to get tighter, I think is the point. So.
Obviously, we've got a lot of money in pockets. One place such a relationship that still get paid. And then the so one that went down and the other day you've got me enough to comment now and too much.
Definitely yes to the second point. Now, in fairness, no one predicted what was coming through there. I was saying to someone before, I remember predicting house prices to fall 5 to 10% at the start of the pandemic. Man, were we wrong on that one. More importantly, I remember quite clearly as well, though, forecasting 120,000 New Zealanders being out of work by sort of the end of 2020. That was because businesses in a survey had said that's how many people they were looking to get rid of. So as much as the economists were wrong, this is me trying to give myself a bit more wriggle room, businesses themselves found themselves in a better position. So realistically, I think everyone got it wrong. Now, short answer to the first part of your question is, did they cut too much? I mean, in hindsight, totally, but hindsight's always 2020. if you would have put me and probably most economists in the Reserve Bank chair at the start of the pandemic, we all done the same thing, certainly with the official cash rate. Cut hard because at that time people needed the confidence that they could get dirt cheap money, that there was that real willingness to back New Zealanders. That's what happened with the wage subsidy and similar as well. The difficulty, I think, comes is twofold. One, money printing is always a very dangerous operation. We've never seen it go particularly well overseas. And although there's definitely a willingness to, I guess, try and pump a bit more money into the economy, you can't sort of do that for too long without often generating inflation. So we are sort of wearing that difficulty. More importantly, I guess, is very much that second point where if we were keen to go hard and go early on the downside, we've got to be willing to do the same on the upside. When we looked at things and we said, look, there is not a lot of support in the economy, things are looking dark, you cut the official cash rate, you provide that bolstering to the economy. When you start to see inflation that is above your 3% band, you know as an economist that it's going to take you 12 to 18 months to improve things. That's when you pull the trigger. And if you're willing to go hard on the down, you have to be willing to go hard on the up. So yes, very much the expectation at the moment is that not only is the Reserve Bank having to do more work, but by taking too long to get onto it, they might well have to lift more than they might have had to if they'd gone earlier. And also I think quite a clear signalling exercise in recent times of either everyone pulls their hit in soon or we will all face much greater pain. And so that's a very clear signal in my mind that we have a choice to make, if you will. We can trust the Reserve Bank will be following through with those expectations and that people do need to spend less because mortgages are going to become a lot more expensive, or we wait and that pain becomes even greater. Now I say that because for as much as yesterday you saw the Reserve Bank say we might have the official cash rate up to 4%, which would mean mortgage rates of 6 to 7.5. If we can pull our head in a little bit earlier, you might well actually see that we don't need to go that high if what the Reserve Bank is doing works. But I think so far, talking to people, there's still a real, and I talked about this at the start, a real difference between what people are currently seeing. Yes, there's enough money that they currently have. Yes, interest rates look bad in the future whenever they refix, but for now, people are happy enough to spend. Unless that idea changes, I think you will see things become a lot harder and a lot more expensive.
Brad, we've got there's the rise of OCR in order to dampen demand, but what has been done on the supply side? So like if we've got these supply constraints which have contributed to inflation, what has been done to address that when we've got people that, like in your age group, who are taking off overseas, which is just going to reduce the number of the people that are available to work? What's in the budget and what has just been done generally to address our supply constraints?
Look, not a huge amount. And part of that is by virtue of the fact that it's very, very difficult for supply to immediately improve it. It's a slow moving thing. Now, I say that as an example. Last year, we saw 22% increase in the number of ships moving across the world. Super important, moving a lot more cargo. The issue is that the amount of square metres on the port side was still the same. So there's only so many ships that you can pull up alongside at any one time. And the difficulty there is basically that the longer you let the issues build up, the harder it is for supply to respond. Now, again, some mental mathematics for a second. At the start of the pandemic, we had very much that just-in-time model where there was 100 units of demand and 100 units of supply at the same time. Awesome, works out well. Go through to the first lockdown, you had everything fall to say 60 units of demand, 60 units of supply. 60 units of demand because people didn't want or couldn't go out to the shops. 60 units of supply because also a lot of people couldn't go to the manufacturing sites. We made less and we needed less. That's fine. Again, all stable. Get through to the first month out of lockdown. 100 units of demand, again, 100 units of supply. But also because interest rates are now lower, I've got more disposable money. So actually demand is now 110. And because I saved all that money during lockdown, I've got that 40 left over. So now I've got 110 plus 40, that's 150. Supply is only still 100, so you've got 50 units extra. Go through the second month, 110 demand plus your 50 gets you to 160. Supply remains 100 because you can't click your fingers and bring it through. So the longer we've had demand run up, the harder it is to run down. Now, in general with the supply chains, what we're also seeing is that things haven't improved because of the further lockdowns you've seen across the world, because you've got China that's been knocked out, because you can't find materials. And I think the risk at the moment is that it could well get worse, and part of that is because New Zealand is locked into a global economic system that is turning in on itself. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we've seen food prices massively skyrocket. 75% of all of the world's sunflower oil, very important in baked goods and similar, comes out of Eastern Europe. Now, that's something that obviously is very hard to replace. Even harder when Indonesia, the main producer of palm oil, a replacement for sunflower oil, saw prices go far too high, said, look, we make this stuff. We don't think that anyone else across the world should be getting it before us. We'll ban exports and we'll keep it all internally, which is starting to push prices even higher. So supply is becoming worse, if you will, not better. What it suggests to me longer term, and again, this is a longer term challenge, is that you will see New Zealanders doing a bit more manufacturing. Now, don't get me wrong, we're not going to start producing cars and similar again like we did back in the 70s and 80s. What you will see, though, is people who are investing more in some very high-spec equipment, people who are wanting to import a lot more at a time. So instead of having things that come in a few days before you need them, you might well be ordering 6 months in advance. The final point, though, and probably the point around the budget, is if we know that there are limited people and we know there are limited materials, that's a binding constraint. You can't fix that. I can't click my fingers and magic up more people or more materials. There is no jib in the country, and I could pay as much money as I wanted, but there is literally nothing I can do to get it. I say that because what you then need to do is you need to triage. You need to have some priorities and say, look, what do we need to do right here, right now, with the limited resources that we have to keep the lights on? Because, yep, I want to do a lot of different things, but as in a naturally constrained economy, you've got to choose what you prioritize first. I think that's what we didn't see as much of in the budget, is very much a feeling that there was a lot to get on with and there wasn't a rationalisation. Very clearly, and I mean this quite simply, the finance minister has a choice either to do it himself or to let it be done to him. Either the government makes a decision on what it wants to spend on and what it wants to have achieved, or the market will do it for them, because they will just not be able to find the resources, the people, the materials to do the jobs that they want to do.
Any more questions of Brad? Brad, thank you very much. It looks like you've stunned them completely.
Probably a very grim way, I expect, yeah.
Brad will probably be here for a few minutes afterwards if you guys want to network and catch up. Really appreciate you coming. Brad, as always, a stunning presentation. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Brad will be doing a presentation tomorrow morning to our Emerge cohort. So he's here for 2 days, so we appreciate it. Thank you very much.